The mountains aren't silent, they breathe. They're never truly empty, never as deserted as the fog or locals would have you believe. With every whisper of wind through the black pines, every crunch in the underbrush, when nothing living moves, a new story is born. Some say it's the echoes of old miners, widows left grief-stricken, or children who never made it home. Ghosts you can almost see if you stand in just the wrong place after midnight. Others insist that what lurks in the shadows is older than memory, hungry for fresh stories and souls alike. Tonight, as you venture deeper than you ever have before, the forest presses closer, heavier, your flashlight swallowed whole by a wall of mist. The air thickens, humming with a presence that knows your name. There will be no rescue, no explanation, nothing but the thundering realization that what haunts these mountains is waiting for you, willing to twist reality, eager to show you a terror that doesn't end when the sun rises. These are not just stories. Hear them, and you might never hike alone again. Because after this night in the Appalachians, you won't ever be certain you truly are.
Story 1. The Hunting Trip Gone Wrong. This first story comes from Jake, a 34-year-old mechanic from Albuquerque who's been hunting since he was 12 years old. He sent me this voice message at 3:17 a.m. on a Tuesday night, and I want you to listen carefully to what he tells us, because you can hear the genuine terror in his voice, the kind of fear that comes from witnessing something that shouldn't exist. Jake and his childhood friend Marcus had planned what should have been a routine 3-day deer hunting trip near Gallup, New Mexico, about 30 miles southeast of the Navajo reservation boundary. They'd been hunting this particular stretch of national forest for over 15 years, knew every deer path, every watering hole, every ridge where the big bucks liked to bed down during the day. But on this particular October morning, the third day of their trip, something was fundamentally wrong with the forest itself. Jake describes waking up in their tent to complete and utter silence, not the peaceful quiet you might expect in nature, but an oppressive, suffocating absence of sound that made his ears ring. No birds chirping their morning songs, no squirrels chattering and rustling through the fallen leaves, no distant sound of running water from the creek they'd camped beside. Even the wind seemed to have died completely. When they emerged from their tent, the very air felt heavier, thicker somehow, like the atmosphere before a violent thunderstorm, except the sky was crystal clear. Around noon, after hours of fruitless trekking through eerily quiet woods, they spotted 2 large dogs about 50 yards ahead on the main trail they'd been following. At first glance, they appeared to be German shepherds or maybe Malamutes, big, powerful animals with thick, dark coats. But Jake immediately noticed something unsettling about their posture and behavior. These weren't typical lost hunting dogs wandering through the forest. They were positioned directly in the middle of the trail, sitting perfectly still with an unnatural rigidity, like sentries posted to guard something. Their heads were turned toward Jake and Marcus with an intensity that made Jake's skin crawl and the hair on his arms stand up. He describes their stare as almost human in its intelligence, which sent an immediate chill down his spine. Marcus, being the eternal skeptic and the more outgoing of the two friends, figured they were just someone's lost pets who had wandered away from a nearby camp, probably hungry and scared, he reasoned, already reaching into his pack for some jerky to coax them closer. Jake felt an overwhelming sense of wrongness washing over him, an instinctual fear that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his DNA, the kind of primal warning system that kept our ancestors alive. But before he could voice his concerns, before he could grab Marcus's arm and suggest they turn back, Marcus took his first step forward toward the creatures. In that split second, Jake's hunting instincts took over, and he instinctively racked his shotgun, that distinctive, menacing metallic sound that echoes through the woods and announces to every living thing within a mile radius that a predator is ready to strike. What happened next will forever be burned into Jake's memory, replaying in his nightmares every single night for the past 6 months. Both dogs immediately responded to the sound of his shotgun by standing up on their hind legs, like humans, not struggling to balance or awkwardly rising like a trained circus animal, but smoothly, naturally, as if walking upright was their preferred method of locomotion. Then they sprinted away through the dense forest undergrowth. running upright with a fluid, unnaturally fast gait that no human athlete could match. Jake describes watching them weave between trees with impossible agility, never stumbling, never slowing down, moving like shadows given physical form. The sound of their footsteps, not paws hitting the ground, but something that sounded disturbingly like bare human feet slapping against the forest floor, echoed back to them long after the creatures had vanished into the tree line. Jake's voice breaks when he describes the moment of realization that followed. He and Marcus stood frozen on that trail for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, staring at the spot where the creatures had disappeared, their minds struggling to process what they'd just witnessed. Neither man spoke. They simply packed up their entire camp in record time, threw everything into Jake's truck, and drove the 4 hours back to Albuquerque in complete, heavy silence. Jake told me that during that drive, he kept glancing in his rearview mirror, expecting to see something following them down the highway. That night changed him forever because he realized that all those boogeyman stories his Navajo grandmother used to whisper to him as a child, stories he'd dismissed as folklore and superstition, weren't just stories at all. They were warnings. Story 2. The Forest Encounter. The second story comes from David, a 42-year-old construction foreman from Phoenix, Arizona. What makes David's account particularly disturbing is that it involves his 16-year-old son, Tyler, and the brutal violence they witnessed will stay with you long after this video ends. Last September, David decided to take Tyler on what was supposed to be a bonding camping trip, their first real father-son adventure since Tyler's parents had divorced 2 years earlier. David had chosen a remote area in the Coconino National Forest, about 40 miles northeast of Flagstaff, right on the edge of restricted Navajo tribal land. He admits now that he probably shouldn't have camped so close to the boundary, but the isolation seemed perfect for reconnecting with his son. They set up camp just before sunset on a Friday evening, and David remembers feeling genuinely happy for the first time in months as he watched Tyler actually put away his phone and help gather firewood. But as darkness fell, the forest around them began to change. It started with the wildlife. David noticed that the usual evening sounds of owls, coyotes, and rustling nocturnal creatures had gone completely silent. Instead, they began hearing something else: footsteps circling their campsite, always staying just beyond the reach of their flashlight beams. Not the random wandering of curious animals, but deliberate, methodical pacing, like something was studying them, learning their patterns. Around 2 a.m., Tyler shook his father awake in a panic. "Dad," he whispered, "there's something big moving." Around our tent, David grabbed his hunting knife and slowly unzipped the tent flap to peer outside. What he saw in the dying embers of their campfire made his blood freeze. A massive figure, easily 7 feet tall, was crouched on all fours about 20 feet from their tent. Its body was covered in dark, matted fur, but its proportions were all wrong to long in the torso, arms that seemed to stretch unnaturally, and when it turned its head toward their tent, David saw a face that was a horrifying mixture of wolf and human features. The eyes reflected the firelight with an intelligence that was unmistakably human, but filled with a predatory hunger that no human should possess. David made what he now realizes was a fatal mistake. He tried to scare it away by shouting and banging their metal camping pots together. The creature didn't flee. Instead, it slowly stood up on its hind legs, revealing its full, terrifying height, and let out a sound that David describes as part wolf howl, part human scream, but with an undertone that seemed to vibrate in my chest and make my teeth ache. That's when it charged their campsite with impossible speed. David pushed Tyler behind him and raised his knife, but the creature moved like liquid shadow, faster than his eyes could track. It struck David with such force that he was thrown 15 feet backward into a tree trunk. Hearing his ribs crack on impact, what happened next will haunt David for the rest of his life. As he struggled to stay conscious, bleeding from deep claw marks across his chest and arms, he watched the creature turn its attention to Tyler, who was frozen in absolute terror. But instead of attacking the boy, it began to change. Its features started shifting, bones cracking and reforming. fur receding in some places while becoming thicker in others. David realized with growing horror that the creature was trying to mimic Tyler's appearance, not perfectly, but close enough to be deeply disturbing. The proportions were wrong, the skin had an unnatural grayish tint, and the eyes remained those same predatory glowing orbs. But the resemblance was unmistakable. Somehow, David found the strength to grab a burning log from their campfire and hurled it at the creature. The flames seemed to genuinely hurt it, causing it to shriek in pain and anger before retreating into the darkness. David and Tyler spent the remaining hours until dawn huddled together in their tent, listening to the creature prowling around their campsite, occasionally testing the tent fabric with what sounded like claws. When the sun finally rose, they packed everything they could carry and hiked back to their vehicle as fast as possible. David's voice breaks when he tells me that during the entire 3-hour hike out, Tyler kept asking, "Dad, why did it look like me? Why was it trying to look like me?" David still doesn't have an answer, but he's convinced that if they had stayed another night, Tyler wouldn't have made it home. The claw marks on David's chest took weeks to heal, but the psychological scars on both father and son may never fade. Story 3. The Ranch Investigation. Our third account comes from Dr. Sarah Chen, a 38-year-old paranormal investigator and former electrical engineer from Denver, Colorado. What makes Sarah's story particularly compelling is her scientific background and the sophisticated equipment she uses to document supernatural phenomena. Unlike our previous storytellers, Sarah wasn't accidentally stumbling into a skinwalker encounter, she was actively seeking one out. In March of last year, Sarah and her 3-person research team received permission to investigate a remote ranch in southeastern Utah, about 60 miles from the infamous Skinwalker Ranch. The property owner, a Ute tribal member named Thomas Begin, had been experiencing unexplained phenomena for over 2 years: livestock mutilations with surgical precision, electronic equipment failures, and sightings of creatures that defied natural explanation. Sarah's team arrived with over $50,000 worth of investigation equipment, electromagnetic field detectors, thermal imaging cameras, motion sensors, digital audio recorders, and high-definition night vision cameras positioned strategically around the 200-acre property. For the first 2 nights, everything functioned normally. They recorded typical wildlife activity, documented some unusual electromagnetic readings near an old storage shed, but nothing that couldn't be explained by natural phenomena. Sarah admits she was starting to think this would be another dead-end investigation when everything changed on their 3rd night. Around 11 p.m., every piece of electronic equipment they had set up began malfunctioning simultaneously, not gradually failing or showing signs of battery drain, but instant, complete system failures across all devices. Sarah describes watching her electromagnetic field detector spike from normal background levels to readings that should have been impossible numbers that would indicate the presence of massive electrical generators or industrial equipment. Except they were in the middle of nowhere with the nearest power line 15 miles away. The thermal cameras began detecting heat signatures moving in patterns that made no sense. Figures that appeared to be crawling on all fours one moment, then standing upright the next, temperatures fluctuating between normal body heat and readings, so cold they barely registered on the sensors. But the most disturbing discovery came from their audio equipment. Before the electronics completely died, they captured 17 minutes of sound that Sarah describes as communication in a language that doesn't exist. Not random animal noises or environmental sounds, but distinct vocalizations with syntax, rhythm, and tonal patterns that suggested intelligence. When she later had the audio analyzed by linguistic experts at the University of Colorado, they confirmed her suspicions. The sounds contained grammatical structures and repetitive elements, consistent with language, but unlike any known human dialect. The frequencies also extended far beyond normal human vocal ranges, dipping into subsonic levels that can cause nausea and disorientation in humans. Around 2 a.m., with most of their equipment now completely dead, Sarah made the decision to investigate. On foot, with just a handheld flashlight and her backup camera, Against her team's protests, she approached the area where they'd been detecting the strongest electromagnetic anomalies, a small grove of juniper trees, about 300 yards from the main ranch house. What she found there changed her entire perspective. On paranormal investigation, standing in the center of the grove was a figure that she initially mistook for Thomas Begay, the ranch owner. Same height, similar build, even wearing clothes that looked identical to what Thomas had been wearing earlier that day. But as Sarah got closer, she noticed the details were wrong. The skin had a waxy, artificial quality. The movements were too fluid and precise, and when the figure turned to look at her, the eyes reflected her flashlight beam like an animal's. Sarah raised her camera to take a photograph, and that's when the entity revealed its true nature. In the fraction of a second it took for the camera flash to fire, the creature underwent a rapid transformation. Sarah describes watching its human disguise melt away like makeup in the rain, revealing something underneath that was far more terrifying than any animal. The body stretched and contorted, limbs extending beyond human proportions, skin taking on a mottled, fur-covered appearance, and the face elongating into something that was part coyote, part human, but wholly unnatural. The most disturbing aspect, Sarah tells me, was that throughout this transformation, the creature never stopped staring at her with those unnaturally intelligent eyes. What happened next defies everything. Sarah thought she knew about the physical world. The creature began moving toward her with impossible speed and agility, covering the 50-foot distance between them in what felt like a single heartbeat. Sarah, drawing on her concealed carry training, pulled her .40 caliber Glock and fired 3 shots center mass from less than 10 feet away. She's an experienced shooter, practices at the range twice a month, and she knows she hit her target. But the bullet seemed to pass straight through the creature without any visible effect, no blood, no impact wounds, not even a flinch or pause in its movement. It was as if she was shooting at smoke given physical form. In desperation, Sarah grabbed a handful of salt from her investigation kits, something she carries. Based on folklore from multiple cultures that suggests salt can repel supernatural entities, she threw it directly at the creature's face, and for the first time, it reacted with what appeared to be genuine pain. The creature let out an ear-piercing shriek that made Sarah's vision blur and her ears ring, then retreated back into the juniper grove where it simply vanished, leaving no tracks, no trace that it had ever been there. Sarah's team packed up and left the ranch that same night, despite having paid for a week-long investigation. The experience left Sarah questioning everything she thought she understood about the nature of reality, matter, and the laws of physics. She told me that conventional weapons, bullets, knives, physical force appear to be completely useless against these entities. But traditional protective methods, things that have been passed down through generations of indigenous cultures, seem to have real power. Sarah's final words to me were haunting. "We've been investigating the paranormal all wrong. We've been trying to apply science to something that exists outside our scientific understanding. These creatures aren't bound by our physical laws, but they are bound by something much older, something our ancestors understood that we've forgotten." Story 4. The Highway Stalker. Our final story comes from Maria Gonzalez, a 29-year-old nurse from Phoenix, who was driving home from a late shift at the hospital. What makes Maria's encounter particularly terrifying is that it didn't happen in some remote wilderness area, occurred on a major highway, in what should have been the safety of her own vehicle. It was 2:30 a.m. on a clear November night when Maria was driving north on Highway 491 through the Navajo Nation, a route she'd taken hundreds of times over the past 3 years. She knew this stretch of road intimately, every curve, every mile marker, every cluster of buildings that broke up the vast emptiness of the high desert landscape. About 15 miles south of Shiprock, New Mexico, Maria noticed something unusual. In her peripheral vision, a dark shape running alongside her car in the open desert, easily keeping pace with her 65 miles per hour speed. At first, she assumed it was just her imagination, maybe a shadow cast by her headlights or fatigue playing tricks on her after a 12-hour shift. But when she looked directly toward the passenger side window. She could clearly see a large four-legged creature running parallel to her vehicle, about 50 feet off the highway. What disturbed her most was that it wasn't struggling to maintain. Her speedite was running effortlessly, as if 65 miles per hour was nothing more than a casual jog. Maria tried to rationalize what she was seeing. Maybe it was a coyote or a large dog that had been startled by her headlights and was now running in panic. But coyotes can't sustain speeds over 35 miles per hour, and certainly not for the 3 miles this creature had already been pacing her car. Growing increasingly uncomfortable, Maria decided to test what she was dealing with. She gradually increased her speed to 70 miles per hour, then 75, then 80. The creature matched her acceleration effortlessly, never falling behind, never appearing to exert more effort. When she reached 85 miles per hour faster than she'd ever driven on this road, the creature actually seemed to be holding back, as if it could easily outrun her if it chose to. That's when the creature did something that made Maria's blood freeze in her veins. It turned its head toward her car, and, even from 50 feet away in the darkness, she could see its eyes clearly reflecting her headlights. But these weren't the typical green or yellow reflection you'd expect from a wild animal. These eyes glowed with a deep, unnatural red light that seemed to pulse with their own internal fire. And as the creature continued to stare at her while maintaining its impossible speed, Maria realized with growing horror that its facial features were becoming more human with each passing moment. Fighting against every instinct telling her to look away, Maria forced herself to study the creature more carefully. Its body was still distinctly animal, covered in dark, shaggy fur with the powerful limbs of a large predator. But its torso was becoming more upright, more human-like in its proportions. Most disturbing of all were the clothes. Tattered, filthy remnants of what might once have been jeans and a flannel shirt hung from its frame like decaying skin. Maria describes the sight as someone wearing a Halloween costume that was rotting off their body. But the person underneath wasn't human anymore. As if sensing her attention, the creature began to change its behavior. Instead of simply running alongside her car, it started to weave closer to the highway, then farther away. Then closer again, like it was playing with her, testing her reactions. Each time it approached the road, Maria could hear something over the sound of her engine and the wind, a sound that she describes as almost like laughter, but wrong somehow. Like someone trying to laugh who had forgotten how. The creature was making this horrifying approximation of human amusement while effortlessly pacing her car at highway speeds. Maria made the desperate decision to floor the accelerator, pushing her aging Honda Civic to its absolute limit. The speedometer climbed to 95 miles per hour, then 100. The engine screaming in protest as she flew down the dark highway. For a brief moment, she thought she'd finally outrun whatever was stalking her. But then she saw it in her rearview mirror, not behind her car, but running down the center of the highway, directly in her path. The creature had somehow circled around and was now running toward her head-on, its red eyes growing larger and brighter as the distance between them closed. In that moment of absolute terror, Maria made what she now believes was a life-saving decision. Instead of hitting the brakes or swerving off the road, she began reciting the Our Father prayer that her grandmother had taught her as a child, speaking it aloud in Spanish as loudly as she could. As the words left her lips, something incredible happened. The creature, which had been charging directly at her car just seconds before, suddenly veered off the highway and disappeared into the desert darkness as if it had been physically repelled. By her words, Maria didn't stop driving until she reached the well-lit parking lot of a 24-hour truck stop in Farmington, where she sat in her car shaking for over an hour before she felt safe enough to call her sister. But the encounter didn't end that night. Over the following weeks, Maria began noticing the same red eyes watching her from the tree line behind her apartment complex. She'd catch glimpses of a large, dark shape moving through her neighborhood after midnight. Her motion-activated security lights would trigger randomly throughout the night. But when she checked the footage, she'd see only empty yards and sidewalks, for occasional frames where something tall and unnaturally thin could be seen at the very edge of the camera's range. Most disturbing of all, Maria started receiving what she can only describe as visits in her dreams. She'd find herself standing on that same stretch of Highway 491. But now she wasn't in her car, she was standing in the middle of the road in the darkness. And walking toward her from the distance would be a figure that looked exactly like her, wearing her nursing scrubs, speaking in her voice, but with those same glowing red eyes. The dream version of herself would always say the same thing. You can't run from what you've seen. Now that you know we exist, we know you exist too. Maria would wake up screaming, but the worst part was that she'd always wake up with the taste of desert dust in her mouth and the smell of sage and decay clinging to her hair, as if she'd actually been standing on that highway all night. Maria moved to Tucson 3 months after her encounter. But she tells me the dreams haven't stopped. She's convinced that by witnessing the creature that night, by seeing it clearly and understanding what it truly was, she formed some kind of permanent connection with it. Her final words to me were the most chilling. I don't think it was just running alongside my car that night. I think it was following me home, learning where I live, studying me the same way I was studying it. And now, no matter how far I move, or how many prayers I say, I think it's always going to know exactly where to find me